we've just put out a new report called Climate Reality Check 2020. So it's got 20 points. If people want to have a look at the whole report, it's actually at climaterealitycheck.net, climaterealitycheck.net. Maybe I'll just pick out four points out of it. And the first really relates to the news we've just heard, and that is, this is another really hot year this year. I mean, the way the data is going, the year 2020 will be close to 1.3 degrees of warming, which means maybe 1.28, 1.29, which will mean that 3 of the last 5 years have been over 1.2 degrees. So when people talk about warming being 1 or 1.1, that's really behind the times. I believe the trend now is substantially over 1.2. And as you know, this is a La Nina year where the global temperature is supposed to be a little bit cooler. So it's really sobering that we're up to nearly 1.3 in a La Nina year. The second point related to that is that we're heading towards 1.5, which we know is the bottom end of the Paris targets. Within this decade, the latest research says somewhere between 28, 2030, within a decade, a really short period of time, we're going to be at 1.5. The IPCC report a couple of years ago said 2040, it was too slow, it was too late, not the first time. So 1.5 by 2030. And of course, you know, we've talked about this before, 1.5 is not safe. If we just look at the world now, you just heard the stories about the Amazon and so on. Even at the current temperature of 1.2, we've already passed the tipping point for the barrier reef. 80% of the barrier reef is gone. The rest will be gone by 2030 because it's simply those ocean heat waves will be too hot for us. Researchers told us 6 years ago that we passed the tipping point for the Antarctic. Have you just heard about the Amazon? The scientists are saying the Amazon's, you know, due to climate change, deforestation, a number of issues, the Amazon is also very close to tipping. Maybe not yet, but, you know, it's in that range. And scientists are actually having a debate about Greenland at the moment. So I guess my big point is that, you know, 1.5 is not safe. It's very close at hand and it's not safe because of these tipping points. And that's sobering. I mean, I guess the second thing is to have a really big, you know, a big picture look. I mean, there's some really good news around at the moment. I just came across some figures from the International Renewable Energy Agency looking at what happened with energy prices in the last 10 years. And these are astounding because in the last 10 years, the cost of solar photovoltaic, the panels you put on your roof, has gone down by a factor of 5, from $378 US dollars per megawatt hour down to 68, from 378 to 68. And that's now the second cheapest form of power. The cheapest form of power is onshore wind, which has come down to 53. So 53 and 68 for PVs and wind. At the same time, nuclear energy has gone from 96 to 155. So as renewables are coming down, nuclear power has actually gone up, and the price of coal for power hasn't moved in 10 years. It's still $110 a megawatt hour. So, you know, some really amazing changes what these renewable energy policies in Europe to start with have provided the economies of scale. So, I mean, I think that's really great news. On the other hand, you know, a number of tipping points around the world are really close at hand. And we really don't have time. I mean, 2050, zero by 2050, Mick talked about in his introduction, is really not in the ballpark, to be honest. We've got to be talking about 2030, about zero emissions by 2030, because from what I have seen, and it's been the story for a long time, long-term targets are an excuse for procrastination. Yeah. You set a target for 30 years, you don't do anything for 15 years. And that's been the history of international climate policy making. The climate's already too hot and we're already dangerous. So, and look, the current level of greenhouse gases is enough for 2 to 4 degrees of warming in the longer term. The last time we had that was 3 million years ago. And back then, the sea levels were 25 meters higher. So, you know, we're too hot already. So scaling up is you know, really quickly is important. The second thing the point to make is that because it's already too hot, we actually have to draw down the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there's a really important letter 2 weeks ago in The Guardian, people can look it up, it was called "Hitting Net Zero is Not Enough, We Must Restore the Climate." And this was a really big statement coming out of England. I think it had the former Archbishop of Canterbury, George Monbiot, but also scientists like Michael Mann and James Hansen. And they were saying, on top of reducing emissions to zero, removing huge amounts of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere is important. So I think it's really good that debate, it's not just about emissions, but also about removing CO2. And we know some of the reasons for that. Your program's talked about it many times, whether it's soil carbon restorative agriculture, repairing degraded rainforests, or whatever. So that second element is now much more on the agenda. And the third thing, and it particularly relates to the Arctic and some amazing work I've just come across. In England, the former chief scientist, Sir David King, who's actually advised the last 4 UK prime ministers, has got a thing called the Centre for Climate Repair. If people want to have a look at it, the website is climaterepair.earth. climaterepair.earth, and they're really concerned about the Arctic, that there's a series of tipping points there that could actually blow up the climate system, to put it brutally. And they said that, yes, we've got to get to zero fast, we've got to get drawdown. And then they say, alongside this, we need to determine how to restore damaged climate systems. And they're talking about the Arctic here. Strategy for refreezing the poles and the Himalayas, because they're saying unless we can make the Arctic cooler than it is, we'll lose the sea ice in 10 years or less. Greenland's close to tipping, and then you get so much heat in the Arctic that you get the permafrost problem really taking off. And so he said, we really quickly have got to look at how to cool the Arctic. And that's not a conversation we have here very much. But I was sort of looking about this, and one of the leading scientists in the US, a guy called Ramanathan, a very senior scientist, said this a couple of years ago, and I think it's really perhaps the key message, and I'll finish on this. He says, losing the reflective power of Arctic sea ice will lead to warming equivalent to 1 trillion tons of CO2 and advance the 2-degree threshold by 25 years. And then he says, any rational policy would make preventing this a top climate priority for world leaders. And I think that's that's perhaps the most important message out of our new report.
David, that's full of interesting things there. Can I ask you, if you wouldn't mind repeating those prices per kilowatt hour with the different fuels? And then after you've done that, because I've got 2 questions coming from what there.
Sure.
Can you just give us a rough idea of just how the science system would be to refreeze the Arctic and Antarctic? How could they do that?
Yes, well, there's good answers on both counts, I hope. So this is figures from the International Renewable Energy Agency. Their data is at ourworldindata.org, and I'll just go to them one by one. So what they've looked at is the price per megawatt hour of electricity over the last decade. So they're comparing 2010 to 2019. So the biggest drop is PV panels, which has gone from $378 to $68.
Whoa.
Onshore wind's gone from 86 to 53, so that's a drop of about a third. And offshore wind, which is obviously more expensive to construct, has gone from 162 to 115. So that's, again, a drop of a third.
This is all US dollars?
These would be US dollars, I would think. So you're looking at 53 for onshore wind, 68 for PV, and 115 for offshore wind. But of course, offshore wind is important because you can tap wind patterns at sea, which tend in some ways to be different from those on land. On the other hand, coal's gone from 111 to 109. It hasn't moved at all. And nuclear power's gone from 96 to 155. And I think that might be starting to recognise the cost of cleanups. So nuclear power is now 3 times the cost of onshore wind. I guess that's the takeaway line. Uh, Regarding refreezing, I mean, the problem in the Arctic is, that even in summer, the Arctic Ocean, most of it was covered by what's called floating sea ice, that very thin crust of ice that sits on top of the water, gets bigger in winter and reduces a bit in summer. But with global warming, that area in summer is reduced by half, if not more, and it's also got thinner, the ice. So altogether in summer, the ice is down to about one quarter of the volume that it was 30 years ago. And the problem is that ice is very reflective, like a mirror, whereas deep blue water is highly absorbent of incoming solar radiation. So as you lose the ice, you get a feedback of this dark water absorbing more heat, which of course then produces more warming. And the other thing that people might have seen, it explains a lot of the weather in the Northern Hemisphere, is that there's a thing called the jet stream, which circulates around basically the Arctic Circle. It's a wind circulation pattern that basically keeps the Arctic weather separate from Northern Europe. But rather than going around the circle, it's starting to do S-bends. It's starting to go up and down. It's destabilizing because of climate change. And that means two things. You're getting these really cold bursts of weather into Northern Europe and North America, which is why you're getting these sort of incredibly cold events. So it's the Arctic being shifted south in a way. And the other part of the S-bend is incredible heats going into the Arctic. So the climate change has caused the destabilization of the jet stream, and that is actually producing further warming inside the Arctic. So the big thing they're looking at the moment, they're about to produce a report on it from the Centre for Climate Repair, is what can you do? They think bolstering clouds, what's called marine cloud brightening, might be the best way to produce more reflection, more cooling. So that's their best bet at the moment.
Right. David, I hear you sometimes using the phrase climate change, but at the same time, I heard you say the expression "blow up the climate system." I'm just thinking, wow, if we had talked about blowing up the climate system from the start,
yes,
instead of talking about climate change, wouldn't we be somewhere different?
Look, it's a terrible habit of mine, because change is something that's manageable and expectant, isn't it? Somebody's growing up, they're changing. I mean, normally when I'm more disciplined, I use the word disruption, which I think came from George Monbiot. I think climate disruption is really the key, because it's not only the climate system that's being disrupted, but the economic system and social systems and people's lives. So maybe I need some lessons in disruption linguistics.
We all do, I think, but that's what we need to work on, and it's starting right here. That journey we're on, where we're using the language to actually pave the way for where we're heading.
Yes, absolutely.
David, what's it been like as someone who was talking about the climate emergency, climate disruption over 10 years ago? What's it been like for you personally to just to have that ignored, essentially?
Well, there's a glorious tradition of people who sit outside any system being ignored when they say uncomfortable things. So many people have experienced that all through history. I guess Julian Assange is experiencing it now, that when you blow the whistle, people don't want to listen to you. But I mean, look, it's been a long struggle. I mean, I always thought when I first came back to this, and we did Climate Code Red in 2008, that it seemed to me, and this was really guided by the great work of James Hansen, that former head of climate science for NASA, he looked at the climate history and said, look, where we're going, the sea levels are going to be 25 meters high. This is the end of civilization. This has been known. This is not models. This is climate history. We've known this for a long time. And I thought, here's another word. Holy hell, this is not good. We as a society really need to show everything at this. And, the best thing I could think of, mainly from my childhood in the north coast of New South Wales, looking at responses to floods and fires, was an emergency response where you put aside the normal operations of society and say, this is the big one. We're going to put aside everything else until we solve that, which is just what's happened with COVID. Daniel Andrews has shown an incredible emergency response and also leadership. Imagine if a premier, a prime minister, got up and did a press conference every day for 120 days and talked about the climate emergency and what he was doing about it. What an act of public leadership. that would be. So, I mean, look, in the end, the word took off because of great work around the world on local councils. I mean, Greta took it up, XR took it up. And so, you know, 2 years ago, the Oxford Dictionary named climate emergency their word of the year. Pity it was in 2010 rather than 2018. But you know, I think the conversation, you know, the conversation is changing now, and it's really a matter of getting past the words and into the deeds, past the rhetoric and into the really hardcore actions, which is 2030, not 2050. Draw down and stop the Arctic blowing up. They're the 3 big key issues for us now.
Yeah, why is the law allowing this to happen? Any ideas on that?
Oh, well, look, I don't want to sound like an old lefty, but you know, we live in a capitalist society. Everybody knows this, and capital rules. We know this. This is quite clear. That's the way it is, and their interest is short term. I mean, the market is not able to factor in long-term issues. The market is not able to factor in ethical issues. The market is not able to factor in the value of human civilization of life. So, you know, we live in a system where individual life is becoming more marketized. You know, we're all consumers, we're all podcasters. You know, it's a contradiction of the heart of the system that the common good is not something that the market is good at dealing with.
We're going to hear very shortly from an activist in Geelong who is on that front of trying to make change here and now in the policies of what's going on. But David, some advice to our little city, because I think that could also be advice to any city in the world in terms of, and I'll give you one example. This week, there's some workshops happening where the council is discussing with the community about setting targets for 2030, for 2040, and so on. What is your recommendation, you know, on the ground, in a council like Geelong? What should we be telling council in terms of demanding or being realistic about what could our targets be in a council and so on?
Look, I think that the simple answer is have a look at the ACT. We have a state, a city in Australia, Canberra, which has set a 2030 for the electricity system, and they're going to get there. So it's possible. I mean, it's really possible because they've shown it can be possible. You look at the west coast of the United States and California, where some new cities have said no more gas connections. You know, it's actually part of their local government laws. So I think if we look around what the best examples that are actually happening in other places, we don't have to make this up. We don't have to theorise that it can work. We can see where 0 by 2030, no new gas connections, those sort of things are already happening. And look, my plea is no more outdoor gas heaters in heating areas. I can't see why we should try and heat a space that doesn't have walls with it. I mean, that's called the planet, and you heat the planet and you're dead. So, I mean, outdoor eating is a metaphor for our problem.
And also, no more gas-fired barbecues on the
all those outdoor gas things are a bad idea.
Mm.
Have we got that's going to create a revolution? What if you can't have any outside barbies over summer in Australia? What have we got an alternative?
Electrical.
But Tony, that is what we are all about. We are creating that revolution. Yeah. I think, again, speaking about words, we're so scared of that word revolution, but revolution is what it takes.
The Sustainable Hour.
For a green, clean, sustainable Geelong. The Sustainable Hour.